Hi, everyone. My name is Brad Shimon. I'm Chief Analyst for AI Platforms at Omdia, and it's my pleasure to welcome Anthony Annunziata, Director for the AI Open Strategy and the AI Alliance at IBM Research. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very good. And we are going to be talking about openness. This is an area that is near and dear to my heart as a longtime believer and somewhat contributor to free and open source software. I have strong feelings about this, and it is something that we as a research facility look into quite a bit. We just actually finished a study about early Gen AI adopters, wherein we asked them, what do you guys do with open source? Are you using open source? And it may come as no surprise to you, Anthony, to learn that 82% of those use open source, leaving interestingly, I would say also that it's a mix. So they're not exclusively using open source. Fewer than that are exclusive. But when you say exclusive proprietary, the number goes down to like 12%. So open source is important. And I would like to open our conversation by asking you, why is that notion of openness so important to developers in the enterprise? Why does that matter for us today?
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons. I wanted to start with a very kind of individual focused reason, right? Developers are people, developers are very practical. Open source is very practical. Open source is a way that you can get started and learn about something and start to play around with a piece of software, like with really low friction, right? Git clone, pip install, you can have it run on your laptop, you can dig in, right? You can do it whenever you want. You don't have to use a corporate credit card. You don't have to get permit. Like, you can just do it, and you can dig in too, right? You can see what's happening, and then you can go a little further and figure out, hey, who's committing, who's active, the other people around it. It's a very practical way to get started, to try things out, to get building. I think that's the one that's like top of my mind. Like, there's a lot of other reasons as well, of course, but that one really hits hard for me.
It does for me too. And interestingly, that aligns quite nicely with the same survey I was talking about. We asked them, why are you using open source? And, I think a lot of people have the assumption that open source is cheap, and that's why people go for it, is because you don't have to pay licensing costs. But in reality, the vast majority of users of open source are doing so because ease of integration, ease of adoption, like you said, removing those barriers to entry. So there's a lot that can be done with it without having to not just break the bank, but break your technical skill level.
Yeah, for sure.
So what about there must be a downside, obviously, to this, and I think if people have misconceptions about open source being it's all about the money, they also have misconceptions perhaps that it is also harder to secure. And I think we've seen some high profile issues with some of the repositories, like the PyPy repository for one, wherein you might have some malware that's uploaded into that. And I think that kind of sometimes gives it a bad name, but it shouldn't, I think. Even so, I would love to ask you, you do this all day, every day. What are the downsides to open source? What should enterprises be worried about?
I think you hit part of it on the head already, which is open source is not just free, magical, it shows up and just happens, right? Open source is work. It's a lot of work. It's hard work. There are, contributors and maintainers, and they need support. They need support from organizations in which they work. So I think first is the downside of open source is it's not free. Maybe at the point of download, it's free, but it takes work to create high quality open source. Amazingly, lots of individuals and organizations support that, and they do it for, I think, pretty clear business reasons. It makes sense. There's a really strong ROI. And, on the security topic, security is something that, it's on everybody's mind, especially in AI. You have had some high profile incidents, not just in AI specifically, but in general. But I think if you look at, take a step back, right, it's always easy to pinpoint specific challenges. In general, I think what we've seen over the past decade or more, several decades, is that open source software is quite safe. It's actually open source methods are better ways to identify and address security vulnerabilities, bugs of all sorts. And I think, that's been proven time and again. And I think that along with that, right, there's also a bit of maturity at the organizational level and in the open source community at the foundation level about how, best practices and how to manage open source security, supply chain security, trusted maintainership and things like that.
Yeah, and it seems to me the key to that is the transparency. And if you have no option, no ability to dig into the source code or understand the contribution chain to that source code, then you just have to trust that it's going to be okay. And as we've seen with like security, penetrations into corporations and data being leaked out, et cetera, you just have to wait for it to come out months later.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's been a key theme that the open source community continues to kind of show really clear evidence that doesn't make sense, like security through obscurity, right? Security just through locking something away. In many cases, it's specious, right? It seems like that's a good idea, but it's really in practice not often the best way to ensure security and robustness and transparency is, right? And lots of people with eyes on it and people pushing code and testing things out and broadly.
Yeah, the community matters. All right, so let's get specific for a second and talk about how companies can use open source to help them with AI in particular. And I think one area of interest that has really been growing over the last year or so is about how you can bring skills and knowledge into the model to help you take that model and make it applicable for your specific use case. So if we can, Anthony, let's talk a little bit about how open source can help with that use case.
For sure. So let's just spend 30 seconds on what is open source in AI and let's the open model, right? It's just really this new artifact. So there's, of course, as we know, there's this pre-trained large language model artifact that's come on the scene and is now everywhere and is at the center of applying AI. What is it? At its heart, it's a bunch of numbers, right? It's a bunch of numbers, pre-trained weights, right? And biases and format around that provide a way to process inputs into outputs and do it in a way that embodies a lot of the knowledge that model, right? That set of weights was trained on, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But it's an open artifact. It's not mysterious. It's not
it's just math.
Not a black box. It's just math, right? Okay. So if you treat it as a black box, it's really hard to do anything with. But if it's open, right? If you have access to the weights, if you have access to the architecture, right? The code that defines the architecture, you can do a lot with it. You can understand it, like its limits. You can go in and tune it, right? And there are lots of different ways that you can modify this set of weights so that it behaves more precisely the way you want in a specific use case. You can tune it to add additional knowledge or the ability to understand specific contexts, whether they be machine-like API calls and tool usage, or just different ways to interact with different personas of humans. So if you have this open model, which is not mysterious, it's a little tricky to deal with sometimes. We'll get to that in a second. You can do lots of things to adapt and tune and shape the way it behaves so it more precisely matches the requirements of what you want to do with it, right? The application.
Nice. Yeah. So tricky. Do tell. What did you mean by tricky?
Okay. So the benefit that we've seen in the last couple of years is that we have these massively capable pre-trained models that have come on the scene that are, many are open and many are permissively licensed. The downside is they're tricky to actually work with. They're very large in terms of the number of parameters, right? The number of things you could adjust, right? So these are billions of floating point numbers, right, that are in these files. And making sense of it, can be a little tricky. In particular, right, since it's really hard to train these models to get them to the point where all these numbers make sense, right, and they actually can produce outputs, right, prompt the input and it creates the output you want. Modifying that and especially kind of modifying it the way like we're thinking and used to modifying software is tricky, right? So making like an incremental update, pulling back updates, right? Like these are tough operations to perform on models because we still don't have great tools, to do these sort of manipulations and tuning and breakdown, right?
Yeah, there's a ton to talk about there. I say just use fewer numbers. Just like quantizing models, for example, is a good way to run them more efficiently using tuning methods or training methods like PEFT, parameter efficient fine tuning. You can, instead of having to pre-train or change all those weights, you just change an adapter layer or just a couple of them here and there. There's a lot that enterprises have in terms of what they can do with these right now, which I think is fascinating.
Absolutely. And there are many open source methods of parameter efficient fine tuning, right? LoRa, quantized LoRa, different quantization techniques. There's lots of specific things, innovations that have been developed in the open and applied in the open. And I think it's really kind of, these are the standard ways that you tune and adapt models at this point, right? And including, you said, right? You don't always need the biggest model. You don't always need hundreds of 100 billion parameter model. In fact, there's a really, really healthy trend where we see increasingly capable small models. And that's a reflection of, deployment requirements, costs and all that, but also that, most people still want to do specific things, specific use cases with models. And so the big, frontier scale models with hundreds of billions of parameters, those are fun. Those are interesting. Those are potentially useful in some use cases. But I think most enterprises and developers, just back to the practicality, they have like specific things in mind they want to do. You don't need a model that's good at 150, things, maybe something that's good at, 15 things or 10 things in a more targeted area. And for that, you can use a smaller model. You can use quantization techniques. You can use, parameter efficient tuning techniques and interface layers to kind of adapt the behavior. Again, almost all of that developed in the open source.
Yeah, it is a great community, isn't it, for that? And I think the PEFT in particular is but one example came out of the open source community. It was not a proprietary frontier innovation. All right, so you work at IBM. Tell us how can IBM help developers to take those kinds of tools in hand and artifacts like we were talking about with smaller models in hand to get to those outcomes that they know they can achieve, but perhaps are wondering, well, what do I need IBM for to help me with that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'd like to mention. I think the first is to make sure that we and others are building and releasing foundational elements, especially models that reflect what the community wants to do, how they get started, how they start to build, right? So actually small models, quantized models, and then supporting ways to deploy them in a lightweight fashion, including locally. That's all really important to catalyze, open source development. And if you can't get the basics, get the model running well, get it running where you want, right, at a size that you can afford to run, well, then the rest, you can't really do, right? So I'd say first, make sure that like the foundational elements that we and others are releasing or contributing to, they make sense for the use patterns. So one of the big things that IBM has done with Granite, right, this is our foundation model series, is focus on sizes that we've heard developers and enterprises, want to use and want to start with and want to deploy. And then we've made a lot of efforts to bring those models into access points and wrapped in ways that make it really easy to get started. So we've got an effort we call Cooking with Granite, which is all about building lightweight, recipes and notebooks and deployments that make it easy to get started. We integrate these models in various places, right, in terms of hosted as well as local endpoints. So we're trying to make it, stuff that like reflects how people want to start to use and deploy, and then B, make it easy to get started doing that. Those are some pretty key things. I guess, and I'll add one more, which is I'd say a little less represented in the open source community today, but I think is like a real frontier. Companies like IBM have a huge benefit in terms of understanding how to close the last mile of like deploying an AI system from prototype to like reliable resource. And the reason we have that, because we're in touch with like really large amounts of clients doing, lots of real world use cases. And so we and others have an ability to better define requirements and goals, right, for the open community. So what you're going to start to see a little more of, especially in the AI Alliance, this program that IBM and Meta and many others have worked together to bring up, is not just contribution to, upstream projects and tooling. That's super important, but a better articulation of the goals, the challenges, what needs to happen to close the gap between prototype and production.
I love that. From my vantage point, I always look at operationalization as one of the critical challenges. And so what you say really rings true for me. I think that is one of the biggest challenges, especially as companies start to explore some of the opportunities they have with open source models in particular. I know we have to go, and I don't think we have much time, but maybe just one quick one, if you don't mind. Given what we've been talking about some of the innovations around open source models and open source in general, what's going to be the next big thing that you think is going to emerge that excites you in terms of open source?
Yeah, I'll dovetail right into the last piece that I said. I think we're going to start to see compelling work specific to domains of application that start to make AI and LLMs in particular, relevant for more demanding, high accuracy use cases, things in health, things in finance, things on the retail end or customer service end that are more, stringent and have higher reliability and quality requirements. I think we're going to start to see that. And I think, you're already seeing it in a lot of spots, but, bringing this just unbelievably fast progressing foundational capability in AI to all the way to specific challenging domains of use. And that's tooling, that's an evaluation, right? How do we evaluate? How do we benchmark? These sorts of things you're going to start to see. This is really the frontier, I'd say, at this point. You're going to start to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Anthony, thank you so much for your insights today. Just tremendous. Thank you.
And Brad, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk.
Ditto. And everyone, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, this is Brad Shimon signing off.